already, but feel free to ask us after the fact. So this class, just like I was telling you earlier, is about owning real estate through an LLC, or otherwise you could do it a corporation or otherwise. Okay, so the main question we're trying to answer for you is this a good scenario for you or your client? You know, generally what scares me the most is that when you own investment properties, you start kind of dabbling in it, you start taking these seminars, and you know, all the TV hosts and you know the celebrities that want to sell you a ticket to their seminar, and they try to convince you of several things, and one of them, to make you feel like they're giving you very sophisticated advice, is, well, you should put all your properties into an LLC. And I think that could be good advice, but I want you to have the full picture. I want you to have all the context in case that's not a good solution for you. So first we'll start out with, why would you want to use an LLC? You know, the main purpose of putting your property into an LLC is for liability protection. So to limit your liability, that's what the company is called. It's called a limited liability company. And in other words, it's insurance. So they can help create a buffer between your investments and your other assets. Let's give you an example. So you own a rental home as well as several other assets, including your primary home. Maybe you own a business, you might own several cars, and you have obviously bank accounts. In the event someone is hurt at the investment property or the rental home, it could be an injury or even death, the victim could sue the property owner. And so if you own that property individually, they're going to sue you. So let's give the example that I own the property. So Christian Ross is on the title, Christian Ross is on the tax records, and I'm renting it out to Joe Smith, and Joe Smith is paying every month, and then he throws a big COVID party and someone gets hurt and they sue the property owner. Well, they're going to sue Christian Ross, and they're going to file a lawsuit in Cobb County Superior Court or whatever county you may be in, and it's going to potentially lead to a judgment. That judgment could attach then through a lien to any other property that I own. Big catch there. Other property I own, which would be any of my other rental properties. It could be my principal home where my kids sleep and my wife sleeps. And guess what? That's a problem, because we're supposed to be doing this rental as an investment. There's supposed to be upside here, and we're not doing it to take 10 steps backwards. And there might be some businesses or some investments where, you know, that's the risk, but you're in rentals, that's really not it's not a reasonable amount of risk. If you have property owners, you know, taking that risk, they need to do it with the mindset of that it's risk. Looks like it's being paused. Okay, there it is. So here's the form. If you need it, you can ask for it at any time after the class. So that's the first example. There's a lawsuit, there's a judgment. That judgment is converted into a lien, and the lien attaches to my principal house. And I go to refinance because interest rates are really low. And the mortgage broker says, hey, look, there's a lien against your house. We need to get this taken care of. That's obviously a big problem. You know, it's something I'd have to pay in order to refinance. I'd have to pay in order to sell. If owned by an LLC, so this would be the alternative, the liability would be limited to the assets of the LLC, which in that scenario is just the property. Your other assets, your home, your cars, bank accounts, brokerage accounts, jewelry, you know, anything else that potentially could be lienable would likely not fall under the future lien. So now, not Christian Ross, but Christian Ross LLC owns this property, and Christian Ross LLC owns nothing else. So they sue the property owner, which is the LLC, and there's a judgment, there's a lien, so the same process, but that lien only attaches to property owned by Christian Ross LLC, which is not my principal home, which is not any of my other property. They can't garnish my wages, things of that nature. So that is the main reason that if you have investment properties, you're going to put it into your LLC. You know, we can talk about some other examples, but this is the nastiest one I can think of. Before I joined Campbell & Brannon, I was in a partnership that bought and sold subdivisions throughout the Southeast. And one of these subdivisions, we would buy large tracts of land throughout the Southeast, sometimes, with very minimal due diligence. We'd buy it as part of a bigger portfolio. You kind of take the good with the bad in those scenarios. And as one of these like add-ons to a deal, we got some property in another state. And in the first day that we owned it, there was a kid that got in his ATV and drove around the property and got seriously injured. And his family sued the property owner. And luckily, in that scenario, the property was owned by an LLC. It was not owned by any of us personally. So it was really it was a work thing that stayed at work as far as the lawsuit was concerned, and we were able to deal with it without being kind of hurried through it just to placate our family or our own risk analysis of it. We were allowed to just kind of work through the litigation. So that obviously that hit home for me, and it's a big reason why if you do own property, you want to put it in an LLC just to avoid having to come home and tell your spouse that we've got a problem, that all this that we work towards is potentially at risk. Obviously, you can get insurance other ways, and that's what we're going to talk about later. So it doesn't have to be the only way you insure against potential risk. There's a chat. So we'll have to go to those a little bit later. So the next scenario, the next reason why you might want to do an LLC is privacy. I'll give you a scenario. So I had a client reach out to me who is a semi-celebrity in Atlanta, and she had a stalker, someone that was trying to find her exactly where she lived. And so one of the solutions we came up with was, instead of taking the property in your personal name, let's put it into an LLC so that it's not easy to find who the owner of this property is. So that was a really good way to do it. So you're not going to find, again, in this scenario, you're not going to find Christian Ross. You're going to find an LLC, which obviously, if you're doing it for privacy reasons, you're not going to call it Christian Ross LLC. And so here's the best example. If you've got let's say you've got a business, and that business is called Campbell and Brannon. Well, Campbell and Brannon may or may not be the owners of the property or of the business. It could be owned by several partners, and many of them aren't named on the name, so they have a little bit of privacy as regarding who the owners are, who the profit margins are, or profit partners are, and things of that nature. Who are the real decision makers? You really have to dig deeper in order to find who the managers are. So deeds are recorded in public court records, and therefore the ownership of a property is easy to discover. As you all know, we search for the deeds and who the owner is all the time. By purchasing through an LLC, the true ownership of the property can be shielded from public view, partially or sometimes even entirely. And so the reason that we can do it partially or entirely, when you can go on the Georgia Secretary of State, and you can sometimes find who some of the operators are. It might have the organizer of the LLC listed. It could have the registered agent, but it doesn't necessarily have to show all the owners. It doesn't necessarily have to show any of the owners. In fact, you could have a registered agent and an organizer who is the attorney. And so I do that a lot for clients where they don't want anyone to know that they own this LLC. So they'll hire me to be the registered agent. And so public record, you see the LLC. And then if you go to Georgia Secretary of State, which is where all the LLCs are registered, you'll see my name. And obviously I don't own the property, but I am the registered agent. I'm the person you can reach out to if there is a problem. And then obviously I contact the client. So privacy is a big thing that really can do a good job. Obviously it can make your job and my job a little bit difficult when we're trying to validate who the owners of the property are and who can sign. And we'll get into that in a little bit. So the next thing would be taxes. There could be circumstances where you could deduct certain expenses to reduce tax liability, or at least limit possible state income taxes on non-resident owners. This is not very clear cut, but generally you could be advised by an accountant to set up an entity such as a corporation or an LLC to deduct certain expenses or to limit your tax liability. So there are a lot of things you could do there. Wes wants to know what I would charge to be a registered agent. Well, if Wes is asking, it'd probably be like $10 million or something. But typically, it really depends. If I'm doing a closing for someone and I'm charging them to do their LLC and kind of form it, I'm not going to charge them very much, if anything at all. But if it's just a random, hey, I want you to be registered agent, if everything's already set up, it's probably going to be something like $100 a year or something. Which in that case, you might be able to find it cheaper going through a registered agent company. So you can go online and search companies that act as registered agents for people in Georgia, and they might charge $50 a year or something. So it's not something I do very regularly unless I do the whole business from start to finish. If I'm already in it, I'll just do it all in as a package deal. The next reason you might want to do it, and the main reason other than the liability, would be if you have partners. This ties in a little bit to what we have in the other classes that we taught, which is the investment properties and having partners. And this is a really, really good reason to have an LLC. In fact, I would probably do this if I have a partner. You know, I would do an LLC or a corporation despite any of the other reasons not to do it if I have a partner. Here's why. If you're buying a property together with another person, which is not your spouse, using an LLC will isolate your ownership from your partners or other risks. And so I'll give you the examples. So two friends, John and Bob, and honestly, this happens all the time. So this is not that much of a hypothetical. So John and Bob are friends from college and they want to buy an apartment together. After the purchase, John is sued on a separate matter. Maybe he got divorced. Maybe he didn't pay his credit card bills, or he has an IRS lien. And you know that formal process goes through, and there's a judgment, there's a lien, and it attaches to the property. And guess what? Now, even though this is John's problem, it's becoming Bob's problem too, because that lien is attached to the property, and that is going to make the property harder to refinance or sell. It could make it impossible to do those two things until it's resolved. So that's a big, big problem. And obviously, you don't expect that sort of stuff to impact. John and Bob are best friends. They couldn't imagine ever getting a divorce with their spouses or anything like that. Who could see that coming? But you could be driving home one day and get in a car accident, and now someone's suing you for that, and it attaches to your investment property, and you were under contract to sell it. So obviously that's a big problem. Example number two, in the event the property was instead owned by an LLC with the ownership shared 50-50. So John and Bob don't own the property, they own the LLC that owns the property. The lawsuit and the lien would not attach to the property. Instead, it might only attach to John's ownership in the LLC. So here's that scenario. John gets sued, there's a lien, and it's against John, not against the LLC, because it's not something involving the property. So it's against John. Well, John, he doesn't own this property. He owns the LLC. So when there's a distribution to John from the LLC, let's say they sell the property, and now John is owed 50% of the profits. Well, that distribution could be garnished or could be lienable or any of those sort of scenarios, but that does not affect Bob. Bob is going on, he's happy, he gets his payout, they're able to sell the property, there's no more management, and they go their separate ways, or maybe they invest in something else. That is the best reason to have an LLC if you have a partner. Is that your problems remain your problems, my problems remain my problems, and neither of them affect the property, our investment. And here's another example. You own stock. Let's say you own some Apple stock. You bought it 10 years ago. And then all of a sudden, someone else who bought stock, let's say it's you, Julie, you bought stock 10 years ago as well, but you're a degenerate. You're just the worst. You've been sued by 10 people. You don't pay your IRS taxes. I mean, you are just awful. I apologize in advance. Obviously, that's a problem for Julie, but I don't want it to affect Apple. I don't want it to affect my ownership of Apple. They need to be separate. And so all Julie owns, she owns stock in Apple, I own stock in Apple, and our personal issues, our personal problems with lawsuits or any of those liens wouldn't affect Apple's stock or distributions thereof. So we keep things completely separate. Michelle asks, if the property is in another state, does the LLC have to be formed in that state? No, it doesn't, not necessarily. And every state's going to have different rules regarding that. But I'll give you a reason why you might do that. One of the reasons we're trying to do this LLC is to limit taxes or to limit some sort of issues with taxes. So if you have a Florida LLC, let's say it's a Georgia LLC and you're buying Florida property. Well, Georgia has an income tax, Florida doesn't. And we don't want to add more taxes to a property or to an investment than are necessary. We want to make sure that we've limited the taxes as much as possible, which is why a lot of people will form a Florida LLC because there's no state income tax. So if you have a Florida LLC and you have, a partner in Florida, you have a partner in California, and you have a partner in Texas. Well, Florida and Texas have no income tax. California does. So we have to worry about distributions. The partner that's in California would have a distribution and he'd be taxed in California, but we don't want the LLC to be taxed in California. We want it to be taxed in either a no income tax state or in the state where the property is located. So it's a complicated answer, but generally what you're going to deal with is a Georgia property, Georgia investors, and Georgia taxes. And so in that scenario, I always recommend a Georgia LLC, unless it's a very large company and you're worried about other things such as jurisdiction or maybe the law. You see a lot of companies that will they'll incorporate or form in Delaware, and they do that because the court systems and the kind of progressive or business law in that area. So if you've got a property in Florida, no partners in Florida, does that matter? So Michelle, you could have either one in that scenario. So you could have a Florida LLC that owns Florida property and the members are in Georgia. There's no problems with that. There's zero problems in that scenario because Florida doesn't have an income tax and there aren't going to be any kind of restrictions. So you could do a Florida LLC or a Georgia LLC in that scenario. I don't see a problem either way. Obviously, I want you to talk to your tax advisor before you make these decisions because a lot of these things are hard to reverse once you've got them in motion. So let's keep going. Why don't you want to use an LLC? Actually, I've got a couple questions. So Al says, do we have to have an LLC for each property to be protected? It's a great question. The answer is have to, no. Should you? Probably. I think it's all about kind of making progress as you go along. So in the scenario above, where we talked about a lawsuit attaching to the LLC, well, if you own 3 properties and 1 LLC, well, that lien is going to attach to all 3 properties in that scenario. So although it's not attaching to any of your personal assets, not going to attach to your primary home, you have expanded what it could attach to. It is now, there's a lot more to get. It's going to attach to all 3 properties. You're going to have problems with all 3 properties. So although it's better than having no LLC, having only 1 probably is still a risk. So in that scenario, I would recommend 3 separate LLCs. You call it Al LLC 1, Al 1 LLC, Al 2 LLC, Al 3 LLC. And that way they're all separate. And so if on property number 2, there's a lien, that would only attach to property number 2 or whatever property that LLC owns. So, but I try not to overwhelm my clients. If they're kind of dipping their toe in the water, someone thinks this is a good idea and we talk about it and we think together it's a good idea. I say, let's walk before you run. Let's do the 1. And then let's get you comfortable with it. Let's get you in the process. Let's get you set up with it. And then, in a couple months, if you're comfortable with it, we'll do the others. And it just depends on the person. I just try not to overwhelm them because every time we do an LLC, we got to do a couple of steps. We got to form the LLC. We got to sign an operating agreement. We got to open a bank account, and we have to update the insurance. We might even have to update the lease agreement if there's a lease, because we have to treat the whole thing as if it's a separate company or separate entity from you personally. So we're not going to be writing a check into Christian Ross's bank account. No, it's going to be into the bank account of my LLC. And my insurance isn't going to be me necessarily, it's going to be my LLC. And the lease is not going to be in my name personally, it's going to be in the LLC. So you see all the steps, which is why I try not to overwhelm a client who's just kind of getting started. But let's say you buy your first rental property, yes, I would probably recommend we look at an LLC and just do it from that way forward. And you buy your second, we'll do a second LLC. Do you have to be a resident of Florida in order to form an LLC there? You do not have to be a resident of Florida to be to form an LLC, but I do believe you need a Florida registered agent. So you would need a Florida address and somewhere in Florida that LLC can be served. So that's the requirement. But again, you can hire someone to do that. Or if you own property down there, you could list yourself down there. You know, it just depends. Those are great questions. Excellent questions. All right, so reasons why you don't want to use an LLC. It's more work. So I just talked about the different steps that you would need to take. Insurance in the name of the LLC, a bank account, including checks for the LLC. You're going to maybe even have an LLC credit card. You're going to have to create an operating agreement. All the lease and contracts are going to have to be in the LLC. There are upfront costs and annual fees. So let's talk about that. The Secretary of State in Georgia charges $100 upfront to form the LLC, and then it's $50 a year to register it annually. And then if you hiring an attorney such as myself to do it, I'll charge you, additional fees to draft the paperwork and kind of coordinate with you on that stuff. At the moment, I'm probably charging $700 all in, and that would include the $100 registration and then all the paperwork that would be needed to get you started. And the consultation, I think it's, there's a lot that goes into these deals. And then the other thing, you may have to file additional tax returns when you file for a separate entity. Now, the nice thing about LLCs, at least currently, is that they can be considered disregarded entities for tax purposes. So if you are the sole member of your LLC or the only owner, you don't actually have to file a tax return for the LLC. You can disregard it for tax purposes. Now, if you have a partner, that's not going to be the case. You're going to have to file a tax return for the LLC. But just keep that in mind. There are more steps, just generally. B, the next reason you may not want to do an LLC, it's not foolproof. I can't guarantee that you're not going to get sued personally. The ownership structure does not protect you in the following circumstances. So you are sued personally for another purpose, which then encumbers your shares in the LLC. So in my scenario with John and Bob, I think it was John gets sued for something and it affects his ownership in the LLC. So I'm not protecting him from losing his investment at all. I'm just protecting him from losing more than his investment if it was something to do with the property. Two, you personally caused the damage for which the LLC is being sued for. So here's that example. Let's say you own this rental property and you're the one that does all the work. So you're the one that fixes the roof. You're the one that installs the windows and puts in the water heater. You're a DIYer or maybe even a semi-professional. Well, you're going to bear the risk if one of those things is done incorrectly. And I can't protect you against that. It doesn't matter who owns it. You personally did the work. You were personally negligent, which caused the damage. It adds a layer, but it's not enough to protect you if you're the reason why it's not right. Or if you're managing the property yourself, obviously you're going to have some problems. Example, you decide to fix the roof yourself and do a poor job or somehow negligent. If a tenant or guest were to be injured due to your personal actions, the lawsuit could still be against you. So in that scenario, the victim would sue the LLC who owns the property. It would also sue you who managed the property or did the project itself. They're going to sue everybody. And you don't really have a way to escape that personally in that scenario. C, taxes. Counties do not permit you to file for the homestead exemption if owned by an LLC. That's a big thing. If you are doing the LLC for privacy and it is your personal residence, just be mindful that that's a big cost potentially. I have some doctors that are trying to shield liability and use it as insurance against, potentially having a lawsuit against them attached to the house. That's fine. Just know that you're not going to be able to get the homestead exemption, which could be several $1,000s. So that's just a cost of doing business, of insuring yourself in this way. The next reason that you may not want to do it is your mortgage. So unless approved by your lender in writing, conveying the property into LLC will violate your mortgage. It's called the due on sale clause. It's a provision that requires the mortgage to be repaid in full upon a sale or conveyance of partial or full interest in the property that secures the mortgage. This provision is also sometimes referred to as an acceleration clause. This is a big deal, but it's also not. Let me explain. Due on sale clause is in your mortgage. It says if you come off title, add anyone else to title, or convey it into your LLC, that you are immediately in default, just like you would be if you weren't paying your mortgage. And if the lender chose, they could foreclose. They could force you to pay it up front, and if you didn't do that, they could foreclose. That's obviously pretty scary. So that's the rule. That's what it says in the contract. But a lot of lenders don't act on it, especially for rental properties. As long as you're paying the mortgage, as long as it's insured, the lenders are going to let you do this without any sort of complaint. They're not going to be paying that close attention, unless they go to sell the mortgage or if it impacts your insurance. So insurance, the lender is requiring that you keep the house insured. And if they notice that you've changed who the insured party is from you to the LLC, that could trigger a compliance issue with the lender, where they're like, wait a second, insurance isn't right. They probably conveyed the property. They may not own it anymore. They don't know if you own this LLC or not, and they could put you in default immediately. So just be careful about that. If you choose to do this anyways, I'm always going to advise the client, the risk that if the lender has a problem with this, you're going to have to put it back into your names personally, or you're going to have to refinance it or something to kind of make them happy. Now, obviously, if you don't have a mortgage, if you've owned this, if you own it outright, then that's not a problem. And some of this other stuff is really not that big of a deal. And so I'd probably recommend you always do an LLC, probably always. I would recommend you do an LLC if you own it outright. If you don't, I only want you to put it in an LLC if you have special circumstances that you're very worried about. If you say, you know what, I'm willing to take the risk because I'm very concerned about, being sued. I'm in a very sue-happy profession, or I can't do it because I'm a celebrity and I need to make sure that my name is out of the public records, or I'm buying this with a partner, we have to put it in LLC. And I would agree with you in all those scenarios. But otherwise, you try not to do it. If it's just you and your spouse, or if it's just you, you may not want to put it in LLC until you pay off the mortgage. And then the last line on here, insurance, maybe you'll accomplish many of the same or similar protections through the use of insurance. So obviously, hazard insurance is the standard. That's what I would recommend. Get the best one you can get. Make sure it's a rental policy or investment policy that protects you. And then you can get an umbrella policy, which increases your protection. I'm not an insurance expert, so definitely talk to your broker about that. As with most things, the answer depends on your exact situation, the reasons for doing it. So obviously, try to make an informed decision. Talk to an accountant, talk to an attorney before doing it. And ultimately, if you decide to go for it, you're going to do an operating agreement. You're going to file with the Secretary of State, bank accounts, insurance, and then we got to put the property into the LLC. So we actually have to do a deed from you personally into the LLC. So that would be the last step there. And you'll have that protection. You'll treat it like it's a company. You're the manager of this company. So if we look at that, that's how people own property. That's why they own property in that way. So if you meet with a client who owns the property through an LLC, now you kind of understand what their thinking is, and you understand, okay, do they have an operating agreement? Who are the owners? Because it could be more than just one. Who's the manager? Who's the one actually authorized to sign? And all of that is in a document called an operating agreement. The reality is some people, if they've just owned this themselves, they may not have an operating agreement. So they've got to create one for closing. So that's not a red flag. It's just something that pops to my attention, is that I want to make sure that every LLC has an operating agreement. Essentially, it's a partnership agreement. All right, so Ann asks, can you assign the property to an LLC upon the purchase? Is that a proper use of the assignment clause in GAR forms? So the GAR forms do not allow you to unilaterally assign the contract. And unless you're paying cash, it's kind of difficult. You would transfer it after closing. So let's say you're getting a mortgage. So Ann's buying the house. Her lender is giving Ann the loan. The lender's not giving her LLC the loan. So you would do the whole closing. The seller gets paid, and then right after closing, you'd sign a deed conveying the property into an LLC. So that's typically how you would do that. If you are buying an investment property and you know you're going to put it into your LLC, or at least you want to give yourself the option, I would recommend you put a special stipulation that says buyer may assign this contract to an LLC of its choice at any time prior to closing. Very simple. And that way you have the right unilaterally to assign this into an LLC, because you may not know which LLC you're putting it in. It may not be finalized, it may not have been registered yet, and your client may be thinking, well, do I really want to put it into an LLC, or I just own this one outright? What am I going to do with it? So you just buy yourself some flexibility. Buyer may assign this contract to an LLC of its choosing at any time prior to closing, something simple like that. A seller, if you're representing the seller, you may want to limit that and say that the buyer remains personally responsible, because let's think about it. The seller is interested in the earnest money. That they don't have any recourse against the buyer otherwise, but the brokers do. The brokers can sue the buyer for commissions. Well, if the buyer is an LLC that has no assets, it's just a brand new LLC, it just got formed, that can be challenging to go after commissions. So you want to make sure that the personal buyer is on the hook for that. You want to make sure you're not, that they're personally liable, which is why you probably want to use that assignment form, because I believe the assignment form or the GAR special stipulation in the index has the personal responsibility of the buyer remaining. So just keep a look on that. I hope that was helpful. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'd be excited to see what you're thinking. And Julie, I will absolutely send the forms. Let's show you really quick. See if I can find the channel. So if you go to YouTube and you just type in Christian Ross Down and Dirty. I believe it's the first one that, yeah, so you'll find all the classes, and maybe it's popping them because it's me, but I don't think so. So you'll find a bunch of them. I've also got a couple of longer form classes, three-hour CEs that we've done before. So definitely keep a lookout on that one as well. So I'll be uploading all of these classes to that. So I think there might be one other